Okay, welcome back. So hopefully you've had a chance to think through some of these questions. I wanted to give you just a little bit of an overview of the history of stereotyping and prejudice work across Western nations, because much of the research is sort of drawing on these examples to some degree. So if we just gave a bit of an overview of the type of thinking in Western countries, in particular the United States, where lots of the research on prejudice has originated from. Early in the 1900s, there was no such thing really as prejudice and discrimination as a scientific concept. Much of the work was actually conducted to demonstrate that in fact certain groups were inferior to others, and that there was a scientific basis for that. So there was a lot of work that sought to demonstrate that in fact women and Negroes were in fact inferior in a particular way, brain size, characteristics. And so lots of the measurement there was science in a way supporting this idea that that negative attitudes were in fact grounded in, had a reasonable basis. In the 1920s and 30s, work on stereotyping emerged where the scientific sort of social psychology community started to think that stereotypes were in fact faulty, they were unjustified, and not real ways in which we should be describing groups. And so they were flawed and faulty judgments of others that were in some way unfounded. Then, of course, events of World War II very much focused the field's attention on trying to explain genocide, most extreme form of discrimination. And, you know, in the 1950s as well, there were some key court cases in the United States of America which started to indicate that segregation between African Americans and Caucasian or white Americans was unfounded and harmful. And in fact, that there should be much more interaction and joint opportunities for both African American and Caucasian white American children in the school system, which fundamentally kind of shifted people's thinking about prejudice and whether negative views were justified or not. And then in the 1960s, there was a lot of change through rights movements for African Americans and females during that time. That has really sort of changed, brought about a lot of social change in terms of the opportunities for members of minority and disadvantaged groups. So groups that have that had less power and were more marginalised in terms of decision-making and opportunities in the United States. So we have changes in people's thinking around those movements. There is this sort of distinction now, I guess, in understanding prejudice and stereotyping, that people can have negative views of a range of different groups, and some of those are unfounded and people think are wrong. The prejudices are flawed and faulty. But in other cases, if people have negative views of criminals or smokers, that those views can also be under some conditions, be seen to be right and justified. So there is this debate about which negative perceptions are sort of justified or not, which are flawed and faulty, and which are not, which is a sort of an ongoing debate. So when are negative views about particular groups acceptable social judgments? When aren't they? And what are the conditions that might bring about those very negative attitudes in the first place? So we're going to start by looking at a series of studies that wanted to examine how do you get more prejudice and how might you get less prejudice? How do you get more conflict between different groups? How do you get less conflict between different groups? So you've got a bit of a mud map of some of the historical factors that have influenced this field. And now we're going to spend some time talking about some of the classic studies and theories in this area. And I want to start with this work by Sharif, referred to as the Robber Cave experiments. And here we have a group of researchers led by Sharif that in the US, over the summer break, which is usually in June, July, many students, many young people, children, will go actually to a camp for a number of weeks. And often they'll go to the same camp year after year. So they're making friends and engaging in activities at the camp. So Sharif ran a series of studies during these summer camps. All the kids were middle class. All of them were Caucasian, and there's a range of different studies here, but the one we're going to spend some time on, they're typically around 12 years old. And so Sharif separates the kids in this camp into two groups, and he does a range of different things to try and understand when there'll be prejudice and when there'll be cooperation. So typically in these camps, Sharif starts by having the groups quite separate, and they're spending some time trying to build cohesion and friendships within the groups that they're in. Then at stage 2, he introduces or lets people know that there's another group at the camp as well, and introduces some competitive tasks where both groups are very keen to win. They want to get the prizes that are on offer in a sporting competition or other activities that are organised. Under these conditions, they're in more competitive kind of arrangements. Then he tries to increase himself and research to try and increase the contact that these two groups will have with one another in a non-competitive way, and looks at what happens in terms of the attitudes that people have and the treatment they have of both their own group and the other group. And then stage 4 is the introduction of common interdependent goals, where the groups have to work together to achieve something that both groups want. So let's have a look at some detail of these different stages. So we have stage 1, where we're introducing cohesion. So here Sharif lets the boys at the camp play games together. They're engaged in cooperation and they're separated from the other group. They might do a treasure hunt. They might do canoeing. They come up with names and logos for their own group. And using a range of researchers that were observing what was going on in these camps, Sharif measures the degree to which there's evidence of group cohesion. And after these kind of activities within the group, he does find that there's lots of friendships formed and there's cohesion within these groups. In the next phase, one of the groups are introduced and know that there's now another group on site. And here we automatically see evidence of prejudice. There's rejection, there's verbal insults, there's name calling, there's physical violence. So when asked to pick friends, people tend to pick friends within their own group and never within the other group. So here is an example of the Eagles and the Rattlers. And they use very negative characteristics to describe the other group, but very favourable words to describe their own group. So this is evidence of prejudice and some indication of negative treatment going on when people realise that they're in an intergroup situation. And of course, Sharif in his studies can increase the degree to which these behaviours are going on by introducing competition. So there was a range of sporting activities, for example, and we can see that people are making flags Eagles, you may win, but we'll give you a hell of a fight. So there's a real sense of engaging in competition. Rattlers that with a banner that proclaimed the last of the Eagles. So there are sort of high levels of prejudice going on between these different groups. So there's burning of flags, there's capturing things from the other team's area and space. So Sharif and his researchers who are at the camp can see that these events have increased, introducing an intergroup relationship and competition for prizes that both groups wanted. You can see that there is an increase in prejudice and negativity towards the two groups. In phase 3, Sharif and his colleagues try and reduce the prejudice that they're observing. So they think that by bringing the two groups into closer contact with one another, of having non-competitive activities such as a film night or fireworks or eating together, that they might be able to reduce the tension and the prejudice between the two groups. Very quickly they realised that this wasn't the case. There were food fights, there was sort of negativity around the fireworks, so the two groups shooting fireworks basically towards each other. And in these photos are kind of hard to see, but there were huge food fights when these groups were brought into contact with one another after having these competitive activities. So in the 4th stage, Sharif and colleagues move beyond contact and think that maybe if they can set up a series of emergencies at the camp where both groups have to work together to solve the problem. So they both want to achieve the same goal and need to work together to achieve the same goal. Is it possible that might lead to more cooperation and less prejudice and conflict between the two groups? So they do set up some emergencies that they have created to test their ideas about this. So there's a lack of water. They have to fill a truck to get water. It gets bogged. They had to work together to get it unbogged. They have to share resources to purchase a film that both groups want to watch. And as they go through these series of tasks or emergencies that they've set up for the two groups, is that they actually can see that there is starting to be the emergence of cooperation between the two groups. That they are in fact starting to develop stronger friendships across the divide of the two groups, and they tend to be able to be in each other's presence without negativity happening. And so after these 6 days of these more cooperative goals, here are some photos of the water tank trying to solve that sort of puzzle together. We get to a happy ending where by the time that all the children are returning home, they are in fact members of one camp group again. So I'm going to leave that there and come back and finalise and talk more about Sharif's studies shortly. So this will be the end of part 2.